Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Don Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgu. Get Recc'd is our occasional podcast
Yearly.
that our yearly podcast that Don and I put on where Don recommends something to me, I recommend something to them, and then we talk about it in the following year. I think the thing about this podcast is we really like to give recommendations and let them kind of like, sit a little while, age like a fine wine. You really get a lot of time to take it all in, to really gather your thoughts
You have to let it
episode to episode.
you have to let it marinate.
Yeah, you have to let it marinate.
We found now that we're doing our 6th episode that each time it's really like you really get better responses from each individual if you get the time to sit and ponder for a year, which I mean truthfully, it's all I've been doing with my
Yeah,
time.
I agree. And I think what's really good is when, say, like what you recommended me last time, where you recommend a batch of episodes and you really split up those episodes over the course of an entire year.
Yeah, or a lifetime in the case of certain shows, sometimes you need
Yeah,
to you need to age with a series to really understand what it's trying to
that's
say.
true. That's true. Yeah, I think my suggestion is if we recommend any TV shows from this point forward, we should actually only recommend one at a time. And over the course of many, many years, we'll get through a full season of a show.
Yeah, I mean that's really how you get the best takes.
hmm I'll say for games too, we'll only allow each other to play 1 minute of the game per episode, and really just like let it sit. You really have to think about, okay, what was the artist thinking when they made this minute of gameplay?
There's so many details like, to take out of a minute of gameplay. And in fact, really, I think if we're watching a film, we should split it into 1 minute per episode because when you
That's
think
true.
about it, there's so much like intent behind every frame. I mean,
Yeah, I
why
know.
not? Why not one frame per episode? Like we could
I
sit
was
there
just
and
about
analyze it like a painting.
I was just about to say the same thing. Like, why stop at a minute? Why not just go frame by frame, and we can really, really take it all in?
Yeah, maybe decasecond by decasecond.
Now we're talking. This is the pinnacle of our podcast. We finally found it after the 6 episodes we've recorded over the course of 6 years.
Yeah, and I mean, what better way to demonstrate how much we've learned than by getting into what you recommended to me last time, Steven?
Yeah, so last time, as everyone remembers, of course, I recommended to you the video game Into the Breach. Into the Breach is a game created by Subset Games. They were also the makers of FTL, Faster Than Light. It came out in 2018, and I don't think I know if I planned this or not, because I don't remember at what point I recommended this to you and at what point in the game's life this occurred. But out of nowhere, they, just like with FTL, dropped the Advanced Edition. And in the Advanced Edition, they added a whole bunch of new content. Now, like I said, I don't know when I recommended this to you, if it just happened to be fortuitous timing or if I did it on purpose. But I'm trying to look also when the advanced edition came out last October.
So it would have been before by a little bit. So maybe that was
By
why.
just maybe that was why. But
Yeah, you
I
see,
do want to mention
this
there
is
was new
this is a
content.
big part of the reason why doing this yearly is so effective because neither of us even remember why we recommended the thing to begin with.
Exactly,
It's a
and that's
truly
really
fresh
the fun
start.
of it. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's like we don't remember really what we recommended or why or
Yeah, it's like in the
to
in the 5
whom.
minutes before recording, we're scrambling to pick up the pieces. It's really fun for both of us and
Well,
puts us
no,
in a
no,
very
we
excited
would
mood.
never do that. That's preposterous. We remember everything that happened within the last year and
Yeah, so this
episode.
game, like Out of the Forest or something, it's a really cool, like, sort of like, I don't know, like a triple A, like right? Help me out here, like
Yeah,
a
exactly. It came out
first
on the
person
PS1.
shooter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the gunplay with the snipers in this game. I was getting quick
Right.
scopes left and right.
Yeah, forget Counter-Strike 2, am I right? Into the Breach, the new hot FPS of the season being 2018 and then also last year.
Which was 2018 if I remember right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um yeah, anyway, this game is
You know
pretty
this game
cool.
came out on Netflix? I just want to let that sink in.
Netflix has games now and that is so odd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Into the
Yeah.
Breach came out on
I
Netflix,
actually played
everyone's
it on
favorite
Netflix.
console. Oh, nice. On your TV with your TV remote?
No, on my iPad.
Oh, okay. Mm.
Anyway, it's yeah, it's funny because I was looking at the last episode, and we're saying that watching Ava had gotten you in a mech mood, so that was why you wanted to recommend this game to me. This game really got me in a mech mood because as I was in the first person perspective of a mech throughout this game, I could
Hmm.
really feel that the weight of the machine, um, and whatever else sort of things happened in this game. So Into the Breach is a turn-based tactics game with roguelite elements. I forget which genre is which. There's roguelike and roguelite. It's one of them. And what that means is that it's like if you had Fire Emblem, but if you lost, restarted. But there was progression that you could carry over into your next play. So the more you lose, the more you hopefully are able to gain and only gain strength over the course of your various attempts. Which is a nice format for me because I've never played a game like this before. A turn-based tactics game. Um, and this one was designed to be very accessible. It has that sort of like addictive quality that a lot of indie games have that you don't really see in AAA games. There's really no fluff. You're not getting like excessive cutscenes or tutorializing. The tutorial was really quick, and the gameplay is so snappy. It almost feels like a mobile game with how much it's kind of designed to be addictive and quick. And I appreciate that because if I were to try to go into many other games of this format, as a first timer, I'm sure I'd find myself a lot more confused. It did a good job like introducing me to how to play a game like this, keeping things fairly simple. I'm sure it's not the most complex game of its type, but it also has a lot of depth that you can discover the more that you play it. And you will be playing it a lot given that you kind of have to fail and repeat to continue to not only learn the game, but also build up your experience and your units and your ability to progress. So in that way, like it was a great introduction to the genre, even though I'm sure in many ways it's attempting to remix and build upon the genre that it came out of. I think also with the sort of minimalist, you know, pixel graphics that it has, it's just another thing that makes it really easy to immediately understand and get invested in. And all those things come together to make like a game which I will say mechanically plays wonderfully, like movement to movement. There's no slowness in it at all. It's great to like play while you're listening to a video in the background or something. It's sort of like Subway Surfers. So like while it requires a lot of thought, if you want to play it well, you're going to have to pay attention to it. It also didn't feel like it was using up too much of my brain power, making it a pretty solid ADHD game. I think like in a lot of ways it is brilliantly made. For an indie game, it has so many things that make it accessible, but also really deep. And I appreciated all of that about it.
Yeah, I think one thing that really sets it apart from its peers is that elegant simplicity because there is a lot of complexity to the game, which I really appreciate and I'm sure we'll talk about. But at its core, it's very simple. Um, I mean, we've talked about Slay the Spire on this show before, And you can definitely tell that this game took a lot of its foundation from some of those Slay the Spire elements, which is interesting because actually FTL is kind of like it's like of the pillar of roguelikes, FTL is kind of like foundationally at the base of many of them, including Slay the Spire, with a lot of its core concepts. But where the simplicity comes in is like, so on your turn, the aliens come out. You have some objectives that you have to meet that are very straightforward and very easy to understand. And then those enemies do something that kind of presets what they'll do at the end of your turn. Like some aliens might position themselves to attack you or to attack the like civilians or do other various things. And then the game hands off the reins to you. And it's like, okay, now you figure out what to do next. And what I really like about this game is one that like it all feels kind of like a diorama. Like every map is just like a grid of, I don't know the exact tile count, but like some X number of tiles wide and some X number of tiles long. It's like a little square, and you exist within the confines of that square, and you have to meet those objectives. But also that it feels like a puzzle in a lot of ways. Like, okay, what enemy's going to attack first? How can I position myself to either get them to attack each other or to stop it from attacking something that I care about? Where can I place my units to block enemies from even spawning in future rounds? And how can I use my very distinct mech abilities, which each time you drop into the game, you have like basically like a starting group of mechs that either you can customize yourself or like the game kind of presets for you. And as you go throughout the course of the campaign, you get new abilities for those mechs, but the actual mechs themselves have kind of like a core foundational strategy. And that I really enjoy, like the puzzle of it all, because as much as it is a turn-based strategy game, it also a lot of times feels more like a puzzle game than anything else. Because it's like these are the preset moves that are going to occur. Now, like working within the confines of what you can do, how are you going to like figure out the end goal, which is either some criteria objectives to be able to like upgrade yourselves or just to like basically live through the campaign.
Right, and it feels like there's so many options to make, like, every turn. You can consider going for bonus objectives in addition to staying alive. I mean, staying alive, saving the buildings and such is already difficult enough. So if you want to go for those extra bonus objectives, it forces you to think outside the box in ways that were really fun. One of the main mechanics of the game is not only attacking the enemies, but also you can shove them by doing certain attacks or certain moves. You can sort of place them differently so that when they do their turns in order, they might attack each other or attack nothing, or you can kind of get them out of the way from your mechs or from your towers or from whatever the objectives are. Sometimes there are objectives for killing a lot of enemies, so you can have them take out each other and try to like get them all off the screen. Either way, like they're all going to retreat after a series of turns. So you can even try to play more defensively. Like if you're not going to be able to take them all out, you can try to at least avoid taking as much damage as possible. Things like that. Like there were a lot of considerations to make and a lot of ways to approach every turn. Um, and top of that, they also have like an order that all of the actions are going to occur in. You can see which enemy is going to do its action first, second, third, and fourth, and you can even use that to try to like consider if I place this enemy here, it'll attack first, so it'll hit this enemy before this enemy is able to attack this, and there's a lot that goes into it. And if you
Yeah,
don't,
plus you have the environmental hazard. So some maps that you go into have specific hazards that occur, or like basically neutral events, like a train going across the map. But then you also have like pits, or you have like water tiles, and you can use those to your advantage as well in interesting ways. Like there are maps with dams where you can one of the objectives usually is to break the dam, but even if the objective isn't to break the dam, if you were to break the dam, then basically like a river goes across the entire map, and you can use that to kill enemies or do interesting things. And I think all of that is really fun and adds an extra level of like, complexity to figuring out the puzzle.
The terrain elements also make a lot of the maps significantly harder on your end. A lot of the times, like, you only get a certain amount of spots you can place your mechs at the start of a round, and that will often dictate like how far they'll be able to move because enemies might get in the way. There was one map I was playing on where like there were mountains across most of the middle of the map, so there were only a couple ways through. And as soon as I started, the enemies blocked one of the main paths, so you weren't really able to move most of your mechs anywhere, which added like this extra level of challenge. I felt like each of the maps had, I don't know if they're procedurally generated or not. Um, they didn't feel like they were. They felt pretty intentional to me. There
Yeah, I
might be
think
like a random set or something that gets placed throughout. I don't know.
yeah, I was gonna say I think like some portion of them are like the building locations might differ slightly, or like the location of certain things might be different. But yeah, there are like set maps basically.
Yeah, and I'll say that like they were very well made, and the difficulty curve from the first island that you go through to like even the third was pretty big. So much so that I never got past the third. um, and there's something I wanted to say about this game is that um, I think it's really really well made, and I like playing it, and probably will continue to play it after this podcast. But from the amount that I have played, this game frustrated me a lot because it just made me feel dumb. Like there was like so much to when I started trying to play the game on normal, which was a big mistake. There's 4 difficulties. I figured normal couldn't be that bad. It was impossibly difficult for me. I think I cleared the first island 1 time on normal, and that was like barely. The main reason for this is the way the game, essentially your health system is your energy level. And every time an enemy takes out a building, you lose 1 bit of it. But that health meter carries across your entire run. I thought at first, naively, it was just for each island, but it isn't. If you get through an entire island, but you took a lot of damage, but you still made it, you're going to be screwed. You get to the next island, now you have like 1 health. There's no way you're going to get through it with 1 health. And while completing certain objectives can increase your energy level and gain you some health, it's usually only like by 1 each time. And that's assuming you can even accomplish that objective. And on normal difficulty, that could be really hard. I can't speak to the harder difficulties past normal, but at least on normal, like enemy spawn rates could be pretty crazy. You'd have like 3 mechs and you'd get like 3 enemies at the beginning, 3 more would spawn, and so on and so forth. And a lot of enemies can like lock your mechs in place, so you're not even really able to get to all of them. While you can block spawns if you stand a mech on top of it, which by the way is a mechanic I thought was really cool. Or putting an enemy on it. Especially in normal difficulty, there was just no way to block enough enemies to where I couldn't get overwhelmed really fast. Now I'm sure that, I'm a newcomer to the genre and to the game. Obviously, like there's gonna be a lot of things that I'm not thinking about that might make it easier for a more seasoned player. But like it was really inaccessible to me, even playing on normal, the difficulty level. I just couldn't get anywhere. I switched the game to easy, and now, like, the first 1 or 2 islands are not hard at all and very satisfying to complete each puzzle. Like, I was still definitely challenged to some degree. It wasn't like a walk in the park, but I wasn't nearly as concerned about losing really early on. But by the few times I made it to the 3rd island, I still just could not do it. Like the spawn rates, while I think they were cut in half from normal, still became pretty overwhelming, and especially the ways that the enemies could move were just felt unfair. I'm not saying that's the game's fault. I'm speaking solely as somebody who is new to it, having played it for a few hours. I felt myself getting better at the game. I felt like each time I lost, I did gain kind of something, but I felt like a lot of the roguelite elements weren't really coming into play. I don't know how much of the game I'd have to play before I could really start to feel that sense of progression, because I wouldn't say I felt it. There's a lot of things
Y-
you gain from completing an island that only really help you during that one run. And while they can kind of carry over to the next one, and that you might have more things you can like um you can more weapons to give your mechs and things like that, you're still going to require to build like these reactor cores to actually activate a lot of those abilities in your mechs anyway. So you still have to like do a considerable amount within the next run to really get anywhere. I didn't feel like I was powering up that much, which is probably a good thing. I'm just saying I found this game to be really, really hard. It's going to be a while before I complete a run on easy. And then if I were to eventually switch to normal, I think it would be a long time before I feel like I'm actually good at the game.
Yeah, I would say I don't know. Just like you mentioned, I don't know which is which. But foundationally, I know one of the big differences between like a roguelite and a roguelike is that one of them carries with it kind of this sense, this idea of meta progression. So each run that you're going on, usually you get to take back some meta resource that you can put into making your future runs stronger. This game doesn't follow that formula. Really, the biggest thing that you get that carries over run to run is when you die in a run or when you complete a run, you can take a pilot into a future run. And we didn't really talk about it, but there's kind of like a light in campaign progression where you can like get pilots and they can level up, and by leveling up they both get stronger for your mech and usually get abilities, but also your mech can get new abilities. Well, you can take a pilot from a run into a new timeline is kind of how they like describe it, and that pilot can carry over into your next run. That's really the only thing that carries over. The only other thing that carries over is each of those preset mech configurations have 3 achievements, and it's really fun to achievement hunt in this game because not only are those achievements, just giving you achievements which are fun to unlock generally, but also you can those achievements give you points that you can spend to unlock new mech configurations. So I was going to ask you, were you able to unlock any of the new like different mech groups, or did you just play with the starting ones?
No, I only ever got stuck on the starting run because I just never gained
Okay.
I just never like accomplished enough. This is my problem. I couldn't get
Okay.
anywhere in this game. I will say like the pilot thing didn't speak to me. Like
Yeah, well, typically I'll say, sorry to cut you off, but typically I'll say those achievements are kind of like ancillary to your progression. Like some of those achievements are tied to actually progressing in a run, but a lot of them are kind of like fun little side missions that you can go on in a run to contribute towards getting new mechs. Like for instance, for the starting mechs group, one of the mechs has like a dash punch attack, and if you dash punch a alien from like a whole bunch of spaces away, you get the achievement. So a lot of times, like you might go on a run into the breach, just specifically trying to like achievement hunt, even if you don't do that well in the mission, like in the campaign itself, just to like work towards unlocking new mech groups, just to try them out.
well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe one of the things that also carries over is that when you buy weapons in the store, they do like kind of become a part of your collection while they don't like while they don't immediately go on like upgrade to the mech from then on out. You now have the ability to add them to your mech in the next run when you unlock the reactor cores to do so. I noticed that when you went to the store, you can donate your items. And as I would buy more items, I started to notice that getting bigger each time. So I think that they did become a part of my collection. But I don't know if I was just misreading it. And then,
Yeah, I think you just have like a random set every time, I
and
think.
that, yeah, I was gonna say about the pilots though, is that was one aspect of the game that I wasn't really enjoying or caring about. Maybe in order to get better at it, I would have to. It felt like kind of a light RPG element that was in there. Like you could name the pilot and give them experience. They could gain experience over the course of a run, but like maybe just as a result of me not being good enough to see the fruits that
Oh
came
yeah,
from
yeah.
that, I just didn't really care about it. Like I just kind of went with whatever the game gave me. If it's like here's the 3 pilots, I just clicked on one of them and went with it. I wasn't really interested in like imagining that pilot as like part of my story or something. It
Yeah.
was very much like another thing that was kind of cluttering up the mess of UI that could sometimes be in the game, which is maybe my main complaint, and I don't think it's like a big deal. I've seen games with much worse UI. It's not that the UI itself is bad. It's just that there's definitely a lot of clutter when it comes to the upgrade system and building out your mechs and like the way that you have to upgrade a mech across a run is a maybe like one step too complicated for how simple the presentation of the game was overall. It kind of felt like it was out of a different game. Like, there are some games like RPG games and such which have so many options that it's like every upgrade is like a task and a half to even like manage. And this game felt like it had that a little bit when it came to upgrading a mech over a course of a run. If it were up to me as a new player, and maybe somebody who's played this game more would scoff at this idea, but I probably would have taken out the reactor core element. Like, it made it more difficult, and I understand that from a balancing perspective, but it made it a lot less simple. And when I would look at the menu system for like what to build up to my mech, I found it a little bit cluttered. Like, readable, but a little cluttered.
Hmm. Now I'm curious because you mentioned you got to the third island. The game does have a lot of customizability. So you already mentioned that there are difficulty levels, so you can kind of customize your experience from a difficulty standpoint. But the other thing that the game has is you can actually jump start to the final battle once you've beaten 2 islands. So there's actually 3 different endings in every run, depending on if you go to the final battle after the second, third, or fourth island. I'm curious, did you ever try the final battle?
No, I never did. I knew that I
Oh,
could. I just was so fixated
okay.
on trying to beat more of the islands and failing that I didn't like try it.
Okay. So yeah, my suggestion for the game always for new players is don't like after your second island, go straight to the final battle and give it a try. Because actually the final battle scales with like how many islands you beat basically. So the final battle actually gets harder with depending on how many islands you have completed. So typically like my first winning runs with a new mech set are after battle island 2. So and the final battle is it's tough, but it's really rewarding when you can figure it out because it's actually a 2-stage battle. I won't spoil it, but it's a 2-stage battle and it can be quite hard. But after Island 2 is when I would try it. So if you ever play the game again, I would just, after beating a second island, just go for that final battle and give it a try.
Yeah, maybe so. I guess I can't speak to that. I can only, my review has to be limited to from the perspective of somebody who tried and failed a lot, which is basically what my experience with this game was.
Which
Um,
is also
but I
true,
still,
and it's very in tune with their style of game, I'll say as well, because FTL is very much that experience too.
yeah, and I still enjoyed it. I mean, like, while I think normal was frustrating for sure, but once I switched to easy, even though I still like couldn't do it, it was a lot more fun to play. Like for me, like I still felt like even if I all my runs ended in failure, they were very fun. Like I kept wanting to start again. The first island, which could be quite easy, was fun to just like blow through. Second island added some challenge, but I usually was able to do it. Like that, it was fun. The progression of the game was fun. The mechanics are all good, and it's so intuitive, and there's so many like aspects to how you can tackle it that every single run was like really different. Even if you're fighting the same enemies in the same similar environments, it always felt like a different experience each time.
Yeah. And I will say the only criticism I personally have is that I feel like the replayability is not there as much as some of the other games of this genre, and especially compared to FTL, which is an incredibly replayable game. Like I've played a lot of Into the Breach, and after a certain amount of time, it does start to feel samey. Like the puzzle is really fun to figure out. Every run, you have a little bit of a different configuration, especially with your mechs and those sorts of things. But even still, for whatever reason, after many plays, it's kind of like, okay, like I get it. Nothing new is really occurring. It's just the constraints in which I'm playing are different, which can be fun in and of itself. But as I've kind of gotten to a point where I played a lot of Into the Breach, it does start to get a little stale.
Well, if you're ready to wrap it up, I am.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, yeah. So it's it's difficult to properly summarize a game I haven't put as many hours into as I feel like I need to have a really well-rounded perspective on the game. It being a game that's based on runs that you kind of have to learn a lot. Like I played it enough to learn it and understand it and have things to say about the way it plays, but definitely not enough, not nearly as much as a player who's put in like tens of hours or even hundreds, right? But I guess the same could be said for most games. If I had to score it, I would probably go around a 7. Um, just factoring in my enjoyment of the game, like it didn't blow my mind. It's not a game that I found myself hooked on, but it's like really good. Like there's not a lot that's really wrong with it. Um, it might not be a game that I would favor, but I did appreciate a lot about it, seeing it as like a game that might be kind of an inroad to getting into this genre. Like as I was playing this game, I was thinking about how somebody who might really be into this genre would perceive this game, and I imagine they'd probably see it as sort of like, a gateway game, as a lot of like these indie roguelites can kind of be. It'll be like they take a style and then kind of remix it and make it something that anyone can play, but it'll still have like a level of depth and complexity that like seasoned players of that genre are still going to appreciate. And I think like as that kind of game, it's really well done because it's a very snappy and addictive game that's pretty easy to understand but like really hard to master. But I think it's good. I mean, that recommendation alone probably makes it sound better for some people than it was for me, but I still really liked playing the game. Um, I would recommend it if everything I just said sounded interesting. I mean, I think if you're looking to play um, an indie game that takes a predetermined style and makes it more simple and addicting, this is definitely a great choice.
And for me, Into the Breach gets an easy 9 out of 10. I highly recommend it. I think it's everything you said and just a really fun puzzle, really easy to pick up, really easy to put down. It's just so breezy and a ton of fun to figure out. Um, we didn't really talk about it, but I did want to quickly mention, as I mentioned at the top, they did have new content that came out not that long ago. And what I'll say about that new content is I don't feel like it really changed much. So I did mention like one of my major criticisms with the game is that, after a long time it starts to feel samey. And while the new content obviously did expand on what was there, it didn't like radically change the formula or add like new twists on anything. It just kind of added more, which more is good, and that more is fun. They added a lot of new mechs, a lot of new alien types and aliens. Honestly, you probably saw them and didn't even know. So I will say it did make the game harder because some of those new aliens are pretty tough. Um, but the new content is good. It was free, so you can't complain about that either. But ultimately, I really recommend it. I think Subset Games just have made two incredible games in the genre. FTL and Into the Breach are both incredible games. Um, and like I said, I definitely highly recommend this one for anyone looking to try it. It's on everyone's favorite console, Netflix. So if you have a Netflix subscription, you can play it on your phone or on your iPad. But even if you don't, it's pretty cheap to pick up anywhere. Usually it goes on heavy sales on like, summer sales and those sorts of things. So I definitely recommend it.
Great. And with that, we should get into what I recommended to you, Stephen, which was the final batch of episodes of the 1995, 1996 anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. This was episodes 20 to 26. And while it does finish the main core anime series, do still have the End of Evangelion film to tackle next time. Which was something that I encouraged Steven to keep in mind as he finished this series, because it does end in a way which, well, we'll talk about it. But yeah, go ahead and get into your thoughts on the final episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion, as well as the series as a whole now in retrospect, now that we've actually finished it.
Okay, so I'll just say like straight up, these episodes get weird. it starts to go into some directions that are kind of confusing. Like during a lot of, I'll say this batch of episode, I was more like confused than anything else. I filled in the gaps in my head to a large degree, but like the exact implication or meaning, I didn't really kind of like get, I guess I'll say, but we'll just go episode by episode. So coming out of the last batch, we have a lot, or we really start to get to the core of what's going on, which is that these Ava units are alive. They start to think for themselves, especially Shinji's. They kind of become a reflection of the controller, but also like merge with them. And we had already seen it a couple times before, but Shinji's unit specifically goes berserk. And in the last batch right before this one, it really goes berserk. Rips up an angel. It starts to eat it. I want to say that was the last batch and not this
It
first
was.
episode from
Yeah.
this batch. Um, so we start off kind of in that situation where now coming out of that, Shinji is hyper synchronized with his unit and like literally merges with it. He becomes basically like gelatinous fluid within the plug, and they try to save him as his consciousness is kind of in this introspective, like secondary state. And that really follows, I'll say, through the rest of these episodes. You get a lot of allegory of obviously like, Christian allegory. It's very explicit. I mean, the things are called angels. There's the crucified thing in the cellar. I think we already saw that before this episode. Eva and Adam. So there's a lot of that, but also you get this allegory of like motherhood and birth. And in this episode, Shinji like literally births basically from like a canal. Like his entry, he's gelatinous. He's like becomes essentially like this fetus in the entry plug, and then gets reborn. Again, kind of like symbolizing Jesus. It just starts to really like take a turn, I'll say. And it doesn't stop. Like it doesn't slow down. This is kind of the state of the episodes from here on out. Um, and then also Misato has sex, so good for her. Get it, girl. Uh, um, so I think that's this episode. A lot of introspection and a lot of them tackling with trying to save Shinji. And then it kind of turns in a different direction. So before we go there, I don't know if there's anything you want to, because really to me this feels like the episode that's like literally the turning point. I guess you could say technically the last episode, like the episode before this series, because I feel like this series in general, now that we've kind of wrapped it up, has a few different turning points, like directional turning points, thematic turning points. I know way back when we talked about how the series like started as kind of like this monster of the week, and then it became much more like insular and introspective, and then it's kind of swung back to that monster of the week, and now it's back to this, and now we're like starting to finally get to the point where the themes are being very present, the allegory is very present, and also the mystery is starting to unravel itself. And I would say probably episode 19 is like the true turning point where that becomes true, but even this episode is like still kind of attached to that one before we really take like a dive into like what all is going on.
I think that I think it did have a number of turning points where it like kind of becomes something different multiple times. Because when you think back to like the first 4 episodes, it was also a very introspective series at the start. You didn't really like the 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 monster of the week portion of this series was more like the second quarter of it. Because in the very beginning, we're focusing a lot on Shinji as this anxious character who's very weak and kind of pathetic. He doesn't want to do what he's being told he's going to do. And so you get this like buildup of like a very different kind of action series, if it even is going to be that, until it just does turn into that and becomes much more of a conventional anime, where the darker sides of the characters and the more emotional undercurrent really does kind of go beneath the surface. In the last batch of episodes, that's when things start to break down. It feels like the conventions the series had set up are no longer applying, and it's starting to turn more into like an in-depth look into the characters and the organization, like the dark underbelly of what's going on, until you get to this final quarter here where the show gets way more experimental and turns more into just like a character analysis of all of the characters. And while, like, yes, you start to uncover more secrets about Nerve, I understand we are going episode by episode, but I'll just say now, you do not figure them out. Like,
Yeah,
not in the show. Like, there's so many threads that feel like they just go away. Like, it's just like all of a sudden, like, you're just never gonna know what was going on. Which, again, we'll get to, but yeah, I feel like it's an interesting series because it turns so many times. Like, it switches in what it is so many times, that by the end here, it definitely can feel pretty confusing and even fairly jarring. Um, but yeah, I'll let you continue with.
yeah. I would say jarring is definitely a good word to use here because it starts to get very dark as well. So even going into the next episode. So in the next episode now, the deputy commander is kidnapped and interrogated by an organization that I don't really understand, but they interrogate him, and a lot of this episode is flashback to how everything started, the work that that Shinji's father started to undertake, the second impact itself, the Evangelion project as a whole, how his mother died, and then we also start to see like Misato and Ritsuko, like their place in the story during this time. And then we kind of learn that Rei is like a clone and that Ritsuko's mother kills her because I think she was sleeping with Shinji's dad, but like Rei replaced Shinji's dad's mom, and she's also like a little girl, and then she called her a hag and she like strangled her and beat her to death, which was like a lot.
It's pretty messed up.
Yeah. But watching it, you're like, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like Ray's alive because like literally you don't know yet that Ray's a clone, but it is like kind of like pretty heavily implied by this point.
I think it's been hinted at a lot when you look back to like the early scenes with Rei. She's like
Yeah,
very
exactly.
inhuman, and also how Shinji's dad seems to care for her way more than Shinji. Like, he just doesn't give a shit about Shinji at all. But it's like Rei is his
Yeah.
creation. So it's
And
definitely hinted at.
I
But
mean, even the scene where she's introduced in the flashback, it's like pretty much like, oh, okay, she's maybe not a clone, but he definitely created her somehow because she shows up with him in hand and he says something along the lines of like, oh, her mother dropped her off and now I have to look after her. It's like, okay, well, nah, good try. Um, yeah, wow. So this episode, we learn a lot. It gets very dark, very graphic. Because then the other thing that happens is Kaji saves the deputy commander from imprisonment and then gets shot by an assassin. I don't think I mentioned this, but in the last episode, he basically found a chip that was kind of like, okay, these are all the secrets of the organization, and handed that off to Masato. Masato hears a voicemail from him, and the voicemail is basically like, in the case of my death, like, sorry, or whatever. He doesn't literally say that, but that's exactly what it is. And she cries.
very powerful scene.
Yeah, I think that's one of this set, definitely that scene itself is one of the most powerful. Like it was one of the most powerful to me. I mean, there's a lot of powerful scenes here.
I
A
love
lot of
how
people dying and suicide, but
I love how Shinji's like in the other room listening, and like he just can't, like, he understands her pain, because I mean, we've seen he's like terminally depressed himself, but it's like he can't fully comprehend it because he's too young, which I think is another thing we see a lot in these last episodes is like they are children, they're like 14 or whatever, and they're like reckoning with the fact that they're not adults, which seems to be something they only have to reckon with because they've all been forced to take positions that are like, you are going to save the world, you know? But they're like kids. And I
And yet
liked
they
that.
are naked a lot.
Well, there's that too.
I will mention that.
I
Speaking of them being kids, the other one who kind of has to grapple with this because she had a sort of crush on the guy was Asuka, who is really like the main theme of the next episode as she becomes terminally depressed. And it starts to get very introspective on how much she hates herself and everything. I think that starts here, but really in the episode after this, like becomes even like we understand that even more. But in this episode specifically, her sync levels start to drop as she's going through this depression and tackling with a whole bunch of things, including as we learn her own traumatic childhood in which her mother commits suicide in front of her and tries to get her to do it as well, from my understanding. So as she's sent out to fight an angel, I'm trying to remember, is this the angel that like tries to absorb her? Mm, or is this the big is this the big circle thing?
I think it's the big
No,
circle.
no. Oh no, this is the one in in space. So this is the one in space that so there's an angel like floating out and basically tries to become a human. It sends this essentially like telepathic beam at Asuka, which forces her to relive all this trauma. As from our understanding, the angel's like trying to learn what it is to become human. Um, so she's like basically stuck dealing with all this stuff going on in her head, while Ray comes out and tries to take it out. Eventually, they decide to have Ray grab the Lance of Longinus, which don't know what that is, but it appears. And at that point, we see, and I don't think this is the first time we see it. I don't remember, but we see the crucified, like original angel. I think, I think it's Adam
Yeah,
is the one that's crucified. So they pull the spear out, and the spear is able to destroy the angel that's in space.
yeah, I have to say, episode 22, it's titled "Don't Be." This is my favorite episode of the series because I feel like like one, the breakdown of like Asuka here is so intense, and I think one of the things it does so well is Asuka was introduced to be really hateable. You know, like she's very she's easily the most frustrating character. Like she's causing the most conflict. She's always like picking fights and just being generally annoying. Um and I feel like it was in this episode where you understand, like it makes her so much more three-dimensional. You finally like really start to get why she is that way. Um and it's just so like the hopelessness that you feel really in this whole like portion of the series. Every angel fight is not even like, no, when you think about what they used to feel like when we started getting angel fights episode to episode and how triumphant it could be to watch our heroes defeat the angels or whatever, versus now when it's like every angel fight is just hopeless and demoralizing and like none of the characters care about doing this anymore and they all just don't want to be here. They don't even want to be alive. The feeling that you get watching all of the fights, it's not even like watching a fight, it's just like watching this slow miserable defeat. And like even when the angel loses, you don't feel good about that anymore because it's already kind of shown us that there's something much more to the Avas here that we should not be rooting for. So now like when you get these scenes where the characters are going in their own heads and just analyzing all of their worst trauma and their worst emotions, like it puts you in this very miserable state. And this episode probably more than most. And it also has my favorite scene of the series, which is the elevator scene between Asuka and Rei, where Asuka and Rei are standing in this elevator for like 50 seconds just saying nothing. Like it's just one frame of them awkwardly standing next to each other, and you just feel the tension rise before Asuka lashes out at Rei, because Rei is somehow the one character who like doesn't seem to really care or understand anything and seems so perfect. And Asuka's decided that because of that, she has to hate her, because it's like Asuka can't be that. And I think that scene has some of the best directing and like artistic vision of the whole series. It's so powerful and so intense, way more so than any of the big mech fights in the series ever really are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a very good episode. And then as we move into the next one, we just keep getting more into Asuka. I mean, she really falls into a deep depression. But in this episode, the biggest thing that happens is that this big circle angel attempts to merge itself with Rei's machine. And in trying to save Shinji, who is trying to save her, she ends up blowing herself up, self-destructing the mech, including herself, and then she kind of just like happens to have been recovered, even though she blew herself up. And that's when, because of some events that occurred, Ritsuko betrays some of the trust of the higher ups, including Shinji's dad, and reveals what's going on with Rei, which is that she is like this. Basically, they have just tons of clones of her, but then she destroys them all. So I guess no harm, no foul there. But uh, so here we start to really get into kind of like what's going on underneath the surface, but still not enough, I would say, to really figure out what's actually happening. But one of the big things of the Evangelion project is this whole like basically it's this mega mind thing that can spawn Ray clones. And also they are used, I think, for some of the dummy plugs or something, I think they mentioned. But anyway, there's a new Ray in town, and that Ray doesn't remember anything when Shinji talks to her, and also then basically alludes that she's just another one in a cog of many of them. And at that point, then Shinji and Misoto learn the truth. And then after this, I'll try to go through the last few episodes here with the time that we have. But after this, then I think Asuka runs away. There's a guy that shows up in this new batch of children to become the next pilot.
Haru, yeah.
But then we learn actually that he's an angel. And he was sent to merge with Adam, which is the crucified one underneath the surface. Shinji fights it, and I think it basically decides not to do what it was supposed to do, because Adam is not Adam, Adam is Lilith. And again, at this point, I'm like, I was watching the show, I was like, I have no idea what's happening. I'll be honest with you. but it doesn't do what it was supposed to do, and Shinji kills it.
Well, what's
And
important
that scene
about
is very powerful.
yeah,
I will say that, because you mentioned the elevator scene. This is another scene where it's literally just like a still frame of Shinji with this guy in hand, who I will mention. I think you were about to go here, but Shinji and I don't remember what it was called, but Kaoru form this relationship, this very intimate relationship. They start to like kind of get romantic feelings for each other in a way.
Yeah,
Or that's kind of how it's alluded.
yeah, they fall in love. Like and also
And this is
Kaoru,
before we learn that he's an angel, by the way, I'll mention.
yeah, like Kaoru is listening to Shinji and showing affection for him in a way that no one ever did in the whole series, and suddenly like Shinji feels like he might have like kind of a reason to carry on now. And then it turns out that his one love this entire series was actually an angel, putting him in this place where after everything's broken down so much with the organization, it's like now Shinji genuinely doesn't know what his purpose is, because it's like, what are you even fighting? He doesn't know what he's fighting. He fell in love with something he's supposed to be fighting, and he has to kill Kaoru. And yeah, in that scene where it's like he just stares at him for like, holds him in his hand for like a minute or something. It's really long.
Yeah, it is really long.
Yeah, I feel like the that one scene is like a really great um end to Shinji as a character in a lot of ways, like having to reckon with like he now has to destroy the one thing he really cared about, and you feel all of that in that moment. Like they don't have to say anything or do anything, you just kind of get it. When he finally does kill Karu, I feel like that's like a very like hopeless moment.
Which leads into the last two episodes, which I feel like are definitely very closely tied. And this is where I have no idea what is going on, but they start the Human Instrumentality Project, which was, I think, the end goal of the whole thing to begin with, where basically it's just like trying to make everyone become one thing for the sake of making sure humanity survives. So in this case, like Shinji and Rei and Masato and Asuka, like they each kind of talk about their own feelings and like why they don't believe they should live and why they hate themselves. And then going from there into the next episode, Shinji really struggles with like his own existence and whether he deserves to live and how he hates himself and he doesn't want to live. And then he sees like what's essentially an alternate reality, which is like almost just like a high school, like one of those high school animes where it's just like comedic and like you have all these quirky characters and nothing's really impactful. It's just like a regular life. And then he says, "Oh, that could be my life, but I'm an Evangelion pilot." And then he basically just learns to love himself, and that's the whole show. And then everyone like is on the planet and they're clapping.
And saying congratulations.
They say congratulations like a lot, like over and over and over again.
Yes.
And then the series ends.
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's really weird. It's very um even from the perspective of a series that has had a lot of jarring like transitions, it is extremely jarring because you didn't mention this, but the presentation of these two episodes is like so radically different than everything
Yes.
before them. It's like very
Yes.
avant-garde, lots of seemingly unrelated abstract imagery, lots of just like shots of like people sitting on chairs with spotlights on them. Like
Yep.
it's very, very, very strange. And it's like
Different
really,
styles too. Like sometimes it'll just be like sketches.
yeah, or even
Like
like
they won't.
even like literally animatics. There's
Yep.
a point during the sequence where it's like a high school slice of life where suddenly it just starts showing the animatics. And it's like, why? Um, Funny thing about that is that they ran out of budget. So that's like, that is very famous. And it is basically why these episodes are the way that they are. Um, they, Ano, the series director, had an intention for how the series was going to end, and it just seems that the studio did not have the budget to carry it out, so they had to like radically alter how they presented these episodes and presented the sequence of events that he wanted to portray. There are a lot of interesting things that were happening in Japan that led to this. It was a very complicated series of like social problems alongside the studio just, running out of money, but there were a lot of things that went down that caused this to happen, and it pissed off the fan base so much. Like people got death threats, mail bomb threats, and all this stuff. It was like a big deal. Um Evangelion was like a hugely popular series in Japan. It had a massive fan base, and this ending was seen by many as like a massive disappointment. Um, you can tell that like, so I like these episodes, and I think with time, a lot of people have really come to appreciate them. There is something very interesting about them, and like it is so unique that no matter why they are the way that they are, you can't deny like it is a very interesting and different like way to end a series that when you look over the whole series, it does wrap a lot of the important things up. It's just that a lot of the massive questions that they kept raising throughout the series, as well as like the general story of the angels and the Avas and stuff, seems to like no longer matter all of a sudden. And I think that's kind of the biggest issue is that while the two episodes as a piece of art are very interesting and very good, as a finale to the series, they definitely leave a lot to be desired because there's a lot of things that just feel like they aren't important anymore. Like even if you kind of get what's going on character-wise, I still think there's a lot that it just doesn't wrap up. And not even in like a satisfying kind of ambiguous way. It just feels like they didn't have the ability to do it. Um which would be like I think my core critique, but I do think that the presentation is like really cool, and the way that they break down these characters' thought process is just as strong as it was in a lot of the episodes leading up to it. I personally feel that if you condensed everything that happened in these two episodes into episode 25 and then episode 26 went back to the general series style to like actually conclude things, that probably would have been perfect. You know, it's not like the series didn't have these abstract character analysis sections before. In fact, there were a lot of them within the previous episodes. They would just kind of be secluded to like during an angel fight where one character gets subsumed or something and something happens to them so they go into their own head. Stylistically it still fits. It just doesn't fit as a conclusion. You feel like you lack all of the major images of the series suddenly in the last two episodes, which can be pretty weird. But it does wrap up like Shinji's arc. I feel like when you look at the batch of episodes we just talked about, it does feel like to some degree a lot of this was just a result of Ano's personal life. Like he was in a really dark place and he decided to take the series along with him, which I think it makes Evangelion a way more unique and interesting series than it otherwise would have been. But there is no denying that from like a conventional perspective, it feels kind of unsatisfying as a whole. I guess it's kind of like it's conflicting. It depends on what you're looking for, I guess, in a series. Um, but yeah, and I'm conflicted on it myself. I think they're great episodes. I just don't think it's a good ending.
I would definitely agree with that. It feels like, to your point, it feels like the setup to something that should be like the finale. Like I think if both of these episodes were an episode 25 condensed, and then you have an episode 26 where it's like, okay, Shinji's kind of like learned to accept himself, and now let's end the series however it's going to end. Then I think it would make a lot of sense. But as the end of a series where on at the resolution of episode 24, there's still so many outstanding questions of like, what does all of this mean? What does like these secret organizations that are potentially trying to initiate the third impact mean? What does Shinji's father have to do with all of this and the project itself? None of that's really answered. It's just like, okay, well now everyone's congratulating Shinji for loving himself, and that's the end.
I also feel like you don't fully understand why they wanted to do instrumentality to begin with.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
requires
It,
a lot of analyzing, and I know because of the film, which I'll talk about briefly when I recommend it, but I know because of the film, and I can see it in these two episodes. After you've seen the film and you see what the ending was meant to be, these two episodes do make more sense. They're still missing things, but actually a lot of what the film shows does kind of happen. It's just like alluded to in really weird ways. But anyway, like there are a lot of thematic elements that point toward what instrumentality means from a thematic perspective, like what the show is trying to say. When you think back to the beginning of the series, they talked a lot about the hedgehog's dilemma, right? The concept that two hedgehogs can never truly get close because they'll hurt each other with their spines, meaning that humans, the closer that you love somebody, the more you hurt somebody. You have to always be at a distance. And that's sort of like the core theme of the series. When you think about that, the concept of instrumentality makes a lot more sense, right? It's like maybe we can somehow avert that that problem if we just form everybody into one being. Like maybe finally we can actually connect as a species if we bring our minds together. But it doesn't really work. When it happens, it clearly is flawed because it doesn't like connection doesn't matter if everybody just hates themselves. Like you can't connect and form a meaningful relationship with anybody if you just hate yourself. And I think that's what it's trying to say, and it's powerful in my opinion. I think it's very meaningful. You can see like Ano being in this really dark place, and if you've ever like been there yourself, like experienced depression, you have a lot of these questions, you feel a lot of these things. The series very much understands that place and seeks to give an answer that might actually help. I just think that when the series ends with a bunch of people clapping and smiling and saying congratulations, it's not really the most effective message. It's not really the kind of thing that's going to speak to you if you're in the dark place that the characters are. It just feels kind of cheesy.
Okay, well, with that, I think I'm ready to wrap it up. I'll speak first to this block of episodes. I'll say, like, this specific blocking of episodes was really all over the place. Like, a lot of weird transitions, and you get into the last two episodes, which kind of take a turn. But for the most part, I feel like some of the series' strongest moments occur in some of these episodes. So for that, I would say I very much enjoyed this batch, but I think I give this batch like a hesitant recommendation because, well, mainly honestly because of the last two episodes. I feel like it takes such a turn. But this series, this sets of episodes gets pretty dark too, which I personally find interesting. But I could see some people not enjoying that. Now, if I'm looking at the series at large, I think I easily give this series an 8 out of 10, probably even closer to a 9. There's just a lot of really, really good in this show. And I think what's so, I've watched quite a bit of anime, and this series subverts a lot of that in really interesting ways. Its characters, although there aren't many of them, you really get a full 3D complete picture of each of them. They all have their own quirks and personalities and flaws, and the way that they play off of each other, I think, is really great. And then the larger just theme of the show, I mean theme in the sense of like, the mechs and the angels and like how that reflects like its own self, like the conflict there, and there's some really great fight scenes, but also like what that means for the characters, I think is very interesting. So definitely I would recommend this. I'm curious to see like what happens with, I think there's like 2 episodes that are like complements or something, and I think there's a movie you had mentioned.
So yeah,
I'm curious to see what those do, but that's what I'll say about it.
yeah, okay. I'll bring that up when we get to the recommendations. But I'll say about the series itself, as a show, I would give it a 9 out of 10. I don't. I mentioned my issues with the last two episodes, but I don't want to give the impression that I don't think they're really interesting. Because I mean, ultimately, without them being the way they are, Evangelion just would not be the series it is. Like, it has this reputation for being a very philosophical and avant-garde series, and it is that. And it's not just because of the last two episodes, but there's no denying like how much of a strange cap they leave it on, intentional or not. Like, regardless of if that's what Anno would have made had they had the budget, we know it isn't because we see what he did make. But it's still like something really unique. It makes this series so different. And that whole final batch, like this batch of episodes, is definitely the strongest, I think, excluding the last two, which have their problems from a series perspective. But I think before that, like the lows that it gets to are so low, so dark, and just really powerfully sad. And like it turns the series from something that was like kind of exciting, interesting, dark, and subversive into just like this miserable like sad sack show where it's just like what was this all for, and I live for that. I think it's a very powerful show about depression, and I know that like if you have experienced depression, the show has a lot of things to say that Like, they don't just they help you see things from a different perspective, relate to Ano the director on a very personal human level, and I think like a lot of the concepts of being forced to fulfill a role can speak to so many things that like I feel like the direction the series went, while it didn't have to go there, it works as a complete picture when you watch the series from beginning to end. If end is episode 24 and then end of Evangelion, which we'll get to. Um yeah, I think like directing stuff, and also, it's just such an influential series. You can see its mark on so many anime after this point. It has its own series of influences. I just watched the film Akira recently, and I was struck by how much imagery Evangelion borrowed from Akira. There's a lot of it has its own influences, but it took those influences and made something truly different and unique with it. And any anime series that attempts to be like Evangelion is never really like Evangelion. They always miss something about this show that I just don't know if you can really replicate. Um, but I do also, as a fan, take it into account with the film, which I will talk about in a sec. But aside from the film, I maintain the same recommendation. So I absolutely heartedly recommend. Um, and we're going to get into the recommendations for what Steven recommends for me to talk about next year.
Next year being Halloween. Ooh.
That's true. We do have our terrifying Halloween episode coming up. I know you're excited because our last Halloween episode, 2 episodes ago, was so strong. You can't wait to find out what kind of ghosts are going to infect us this time.
Well, for this Halloween episode, I'm going to recommend a board game, but a spooky one. A Ouija board. No, just kidding. I'm going to recommend a board game called My Father's Work. My Father's Work is a board game where there are 3 potential scenarios that you can play. In each scenario, the concept is you are a family going through multiple generations trying to complete your father's work, where those works are maybe a monster, a love potion, lycanthropy, could be anything. So next time we will talk about My Father's Work.
Yes, and I, for Halloween, will not be recommending End of Evangelion, as I briefly forgot a moment ago, so you're going to have to wait for everything I was suggesting there till next episode. Um, that was my mistake. I guess a ghost got in my head or something and cursed me into saying something that would throw you off.
As they are wont to do.
I know, all the time. But Steven, I'm recommending to you the 2004 film Saw. Saw is a um, relatively low budget film created by James Wan and another dude. Wait, uh, yeah, you can look it up. I didn't have it in front of me. James Wan and Lei Whannell. That's right. It started as like kind of a student film that they ended up pitching to studios and eventually got it made as a full feature-length film. We all know where the Saw franchise went from there. You of course have, I think the new one is out right now, Saw 10. But anyway, it's a film about being in a trap with a saw and police stuff and a spooky serial killer. So it's great for Halloween. They also used to come out every Halloween. Like every Halloween, they put out a Saw movie. We will just be talking about the first. That will be for next time. And yes, thank you for listening to our yearly podcast. I can't wait to see you again in 2024. Um, but actually, we will be back in time for this Halloween. We apologize for the break. There's no excuse. There's no excuse. I will grovel at my feet and apologize profusely for leaving you without Get Recc'd for 1 year. I am very sorry.
But as we mentioned, just like we ourselves give recs that we can ruminate on. Everyone listening, we're able to like slowly listen to the podcast over the course of a year.
Yeah, on like 0.00001 times speed.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Allowing them to ruminate on every
Yeah.
sound of the
On
syllables.
every word.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, you know, while I apologize for the wait, I do have to say
You're
you're
welcome.
welcome.
Yeah, you're also welcome.
But yeah, we will see you next time around Halloween. And I don't know if you have anything else to say, Stephen.
No.
And with that, those were our thoughts and those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.